John's. And I'd like to introduce John Buchanan, and John's official title is Director Workplace Research Centre at the University of Sydney. And the focus of this is that John is going to present to us now, but if we're going to hold questions until after morning tea, because we're going to set up a panel session after that, and we'll welcome some people into the panel. So if you could hold your questions for John, and we'll do it like that. This is the 6th time we have done this presentation and panel session across Australia, and it's been at request that we've done it. So we've been to New South Wales, Melbourne, Tasmania, Perth, webinars, and now we're up in Queensland. So it shows you about the people want to know about this work, and also the taste for having a look for the way forward. I think that's one of the main things, and as Jodie and Claire presented, and John's going to follow up with a different focus. So as I said, the format's a panel discussion. And John's going to present to us today on vocations, the link between post-compulsory education and the labour market. There is a whole suite of research reports out there on the NCVER website, but also the presentation will be available. And as I said, we've already done the webinar, so if you missed something, please feel free to go onto the NCVER website to catch up on this. Thanks very much. I'll introduce John.
Thanks, Jodie. Thanks, Jodie, and thanks to the NCVER for inviting me to speak today. And I was introduced as this is John's presentation. Can I say I am the weather girl on this one? There were 3 immediate authors for this. Lisa Wheelerhand, who's now at the University of Toronto, and Serena Yu, who's now at UTS. But there was a research team of 15, and as you'll see from the acknowledgements, there's a lot of people behind it. Now, I don't want to look like a crawler, but the NCVER does deserve the highest of praise for backing us on this. We put in a large project proposal about 4 years ago, and it was a team of 3 institutions, and the NCVER backed basically a team of 10 to look at these issues over 3 years. That doesn't happen very often, and like I say, it isn't crawling, it's just acknowledgement that in Australian public policy, I think we need more of this kind of thing. And it's not just the money, it's the attitude. NCVER gave us a lot of flexibility to go into some pretty dangerous places, and I nearly got lynched the first time I gave a presentation around this, so that's a sign that the NCVER, and it wasn't by being lynched by the NCVER, it was the ITABs, or the ISCs. Can I also give acknowledgement to the other team members? I've listed them there, but Lisa Wheelerhand was the prime research leader for this. I was the deputy chief investigator. Lisa was if you like, the educational locomotive. I was the labour market researcher. And Lisa had a stronger vision of people as citizens, and I had a stronger vision of people as productive beings. And she beat me down as a kind of left productivist, and I beat her down as being too idealistic. So it kind of comes together, I think, because there's that tension. And then I've got to say there are de facto partners. The New South Wales BVET, what's now the Skills Board, has been a real complement to the NCVER in testing out dangerous ideas in the vet space, and they've been backing research that I've been involved with for the last 15 years. The Australian Education Union originally triggered this research. Pat Ford got us in at the time of the GFC and said, how could vet respond to a crisis in the economy? The Australian Qualifications Framework Council was once again prepared to take us on and get us to test out the ideas that they were exploring when they were looking at the new quals framework. And then AURPA and the ISCs, especially the Community Services and Skills and Health Services and Health Council, were very good. Can I say, I'm not implicating them in anything I'm about to say, I'm just giving them recognition that they gave us space. They would not necessarily agree with everything we say, but I just think they should be acknowledged. And then finally, I like to give presentations of 10 to 15 minutes in length, but I'm generally told around this one that people would rather see the movie of the book. There are 14 research reports around what I'm saying, and so people say they'd rather I spoke for 45 minutes so they didn't have to sit down and read 14 reports. So if I'm getting boring, just say, wrap it up, John. But otherwise, I'll be going for about 40 minutes. So I address this around 6 questions. Why did we do it? How did we do it? What did we find? Was it worth doing? And where should we go next? And I'll just kick off with, well, why did we do it? One of my favourite quotes is from T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men. The stanzas towards the end. Between the idea and the reality, between the conception and the creation, falls the shadow. And anyone who's involved in vet and workforce development in Australia today knows we're living in a big shadow, because there's an edifice that says this is the way the world works, and then there's a reality, and there's very little connection between the two. So the prime motivation was to explore the nature of that shadow. And here, I suppose, we were particularly intrigued by the assumptions, the key conceptions driving vet. And it's what we call the kind of hairy-chested vision of vet. You know, who's got more of what? You know, the COAG Workforce Development Agreement put out targets. You know, it basically wants everyone to have qualifications. There's the hairy-chested campaign on who's got more apprentices and trainees by jurisdictions. And there's this assumption that more and higher level qualifications equals economic success. It's a very supply-side driven vision of the future. And we think that this is actually not necessarily a very helpful way of thinking about things. And so we said, how do current quals link with the labour market, and how can better linkages be established? But we're also interested in going into not just simply being self-indulgent academics who could say we're living in the shadows. We also wanted to say, how can we move forward? And that was what was so interesting about this project. The NCVER said, don't just give us the analysis of what is, give us a thoughtful framework on where we could go differently. So how did we do it? We went about it in a very distinctive way. And I want to start off with an example from history, because too much of the policy debate is, do we just need to do what we're doing better? Right? This is the kind of classic that the framework's fine, it's just not being implemented well. And you see this with all the push to further marketisation. Basically, we haven't smashed TAFE enough, so we've got to move on and get more private providers in. That's the kind of vision that's been prevailing. Well, I want to take a sidestep here. Let's look at the history of the Vietnam War. In 1968, General Westmoreland said, I've only got 500,000 US troops here. If only I could have another 250,000, I'd solve the problem. But the problem was the strategy. Right? The strategy in Vietnam was not to occupy territory. It was to have kill rates. It was done on KPIs. For every American killed, they had to kill 9 Vietnamese. The Americans hit that KPI persistently, and they lost the war. So if you'd put in another 250,000, you just would have been simply going faster down the wrong road. That's where we are with VET today. And so for us, how do we do it? We said, well, let's be sceptical of the conception. The challenge isn't just to explore that shadow and try and shed light onto it. Maybe there's something wrong in the way in which we conceive where we're going. So the second thing is, as researchers, we think it's important to have a reflection on paradoxes. It's not as if the current system's all flawed and there's a new shining model out there. As a researcher, it's fantastic if you can find a paradox to get behind and find out why you've got these things that don't seem to add up. So the 3 paradoxes drove us. Whilst the number of vet quals has expanded endlessly, the actual connections between vet and the labour market seem to be weakening. Right? And so Tom Carmel's got that great paper, Tom Carmel and his colleagues, How Vocational is Vet, and finds only about a third of people with jobs at the moment have them actually linked to their vet quals. Now, we don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, but the whole framing of the current system is train here, work there. So there's something not right. We've had more and more quals, which should be getting more tailored to the labour market, but in fact the disconnect seems to be getting worse. There are significant complaints about skill shortages from employers. They can never say they get the right people. But then if you talk to most workers, they're saying no one's using my skills. So, you know, skill shortage, skill underutilisation. And then finally, vet's conceived as being about vocational development. And what are the unis doing? They're moving down the occupational hierarchy. So there's, you know, we love this. As researchers, things just don't look right. So let's try and go behind it. So we were exploring those paradoxes. And so how do we do it? This is the nuts and bolts of how we did it. When we served it up to the NCVER selection panel, we said there are 2 coordinates for our work: education, work and economic renewal, which is a paper we did for the AEU, who wanted us to come up with a clear vision of what's the role of the private provider in vet. And we said, well, we could give you the arguments about public goods, but that's not what's needed at the moment. You actually need a vision of what's the role of skills in the economy. And so we did that, and the AEU was very good in letting us explore that, and that's where we mapped out the initial ideas here of moving beyond the notion of competency-based training. Lisa Wheelahan and Gavin Movie then took that way further in their paper from competence to capability, where they basically said the competency-based training system is the problem. And that was produced for the NCVER, for BVET. And so we said we want to take this further, and we want to look at 3 distinct relationships. Vet in schools, vet higher ed connections, and pathways in the labour market. And there was a research team around each of those issues. And then we explored it over 3 years. In year 1, we were going to scope. Now, you'll probably say only some kind of, wanky academic from Sydney did say this, but we said we needed a year to actually get our concepts straight. Like before rushing off and saying we know what the problems are, we need to argue amongst ourselves on how you go about doing this. And the NCVER indulged us. They said, fine, get your questions right. And there was a synthesis paper came out of that, and that's on the web. So having clarified our concepts, and can I say, Lisa and I are great personal friends, but I come from the kind of political economy stream. She comes from education. There were serious tensions in there, and it's worth reflecting on how we could try and work better. So we did the scoping. We then, in the second year, looked at what is actually going on with vet in schools, what is going on in vet higher ed and vet pathways, and what's going on in the labour market. And then in the third year, having figured out, we think what's been going on there, we said, how would you do it differently? And we did this. I'm a labour market researcher, so I like to think in the economy in the whole, but my first training is as history. In history, I love detail. And we said in doing this research, let's follow 4 domains through in great detail. So we looked at agriculture, we looked at care work, we looked at finance, and we looked at engineering. So in each of those 3 years, we said, how would you think about these issues in those 4 sectors? So that's the framing. Now, can I give you an audience alert? The next PowerPoint will be troubling because it's 14 reports in 1 slide. And that's the 2. So this is in 2 slides. So this is the first set of findings. Where did we start from analytically, and how do we get our concepts framed? Our conclusion at the end of the first year is that the mainstream analysis and policy starts at the wrong point. It starts with current jobs. Right? It says we've got to look at current jobs and map the curriculum back from that. It assumes individuals are generically employable and generically trainable. And it has a linear vision of pathways and unconnected competencies. And we think each of those assumptions gets you off going down the wrong road. And we said the real problem that needs to be addressed is, and you've probably heard this amongst policymakers, people rail against those evil and elite universities who are destroying articulation between vet and higher ed. Yes, there is a problem with some evil and elite universities, but that's like a 19th order problem, right? Yes, it is a problem. The really big problem is segmentation in the labour market. The problem's what's going on in the way in which employers define jobs. It's easy to bash the education system. Everyone loves to attack it, teachers, but the problem isn't primarily within the education system. And so we said, okay, we need better tools for underpinning reality. And we had 3 concepts that drove us here. The first comes from Sen and Nussbaum's notions of human capability. Now, I don't know if you know Martha Nussbaum, but she's kind of a rock star in academic circles. I mean, this woman is brilliant in political philosophy, political theory, feminist studies and the like. And she and Sen have argued that in thinking about public policy, we've got to have a bigger vision. And the vision's got to be about human flourishing. Life should be about making humans better people. It's not about economic growth. What's the use of having economic growth if humans don't flourish? And this has been a very powerful way of thinking that has now permeated. Even Treasury under Ken Henry had a capabilities framework. And so the framing was, how do you basically get people into a situation where they can choose to live lives that they're happy with. That's the criteria for success. How do you give people the capability to make decisions that they flourish in? Now, the problem with the human capability literature is that it is very, it's pitched at a very high level. And we're labour market and vet researchers, and we've said, you just can't have a generic capability. There's a lot in education theory about capability, but once again, it's all pitched, particularly at the levels of generic skills and the like. We said, no, the labour market's more nuanced than that. And we developed a modern notion of what we call vocations. And these are domains where different occupations kind of cluster together. And having been a labour market researcher for 25 years, looking across the studies I've done, I hypothesise there are domains like engineering, like care work, like customer service, like animal and land husbandry. These are domains where you can cluster activity, which is, and we heard the example in the last presentation, we can look at a care worker who brings together a bit of physio work, a bit of nursing work, a bit of diagnostic work. It's those broader domains of vocation that we thought we're exploring. But the third concept we grapple with comes out of industrial relations, and that is skills are highly contested. Right? Skills are not scientific. Yes, there's a technical concept, but if you look at something as technical as engineering, the form engineering takes in the US is very different to what it takes in Germany and what it takes in Japan. They're working with the common technologies, but there's politics and culture in there as well. And so for us, when you're thinking about skill, you've got to look at this notion of communities of trust. And I'll elaborate on this as the analysis unfolds. So that's the first major set of findings. You've got to get your concepts straight. And that's kind of what came out of our first scoping year. Now, this is the real hazardous PowerPoint, because these are the reports boiled down into one page. I just ripped through these because I can't tell you about the whole study in detail. Most of my presentation after this slide will be on the labour market bit, Strand 3, but I thought I'd just summarise what went on in Strands 1 and 2, because as educators you'll be particularly interested in this. Strand 1, vet in schools. Simple conclusion, current models do not provide strong transitions to the labour market, traditional apprenticeships or post-school quals. Many researchers died for that statement to be said. The people who did that part of the report had the hardest time of all of us, because NCVER has referees. They got hammered, but they survived, and I can say that there are fundamental problems with vetting schools. There are some fantastic parts of vetting schools. We've seen them, we study them in our report. We're not condemning vetting schools, but the bulk of the system is there to simply soak up increased retention rates in a system that's still designed for universities. We got it there. If you want some authority, that's the point. So in moving forward, we think you've got to have very clear targets for vetting schools. Can I say I'm a very strong supporter in vetting schools? Anyone who knows me knows that I love the trades and artisanal type work. I'm not against vetting schools, and in fact I'm against academic elitism. But you've got to, if you want vetting schools to flourish, you've got to have some very clear targets. And instead of this kind of general vetting schools qual, you need two targets. You're either getting them into a higher level vet qual, or you're getting them into apprenticeship. And if vetting schools doesn't lead to that, get rid of it. That gets rid of an awful lot of vetting schools at the moment. So it's a real rethinking going on. It either leads to an apprenticeship or it leads to a higher level vet qual. And you've got to have educational experiences that can sustain that. Second, Lisa and Gavin led the section on the vet higher ed pathways. And there is a lot in here, but fundamentally the most powerful insight was you've got to recognise that quals link to the labour market in one of four different ways. There's the standard way that quals move in a hierarchical fashion with a career path. And the classic case here is nursing, right? You can do a Cert 2 or 3 as a PCA, you can do a Cert 4 and diploma, turning you into an enrolled nurse, and then you can do a degree that leads to an RN. Now, that's a very New South Wales way of saying it, because I know nurses are called different things all around the country, but you get the drift. There's a kind of basic vet level qual, there's the person just before the registered nurse, and then there's a person above the registered nurse. Moves through the quals, moves through the labour market. They're nicely linked. very little of the labour market is like that. But when we think about quals and we think about the labour market, that's the kind of tacit framing that's going on. The second model they identify comes out of engineering. In engineering, we particularly looked at electrical engineering. You've got the Cert 3 leads to the electrician, electrical fitter or general electrical trades worker. And then you've got the degree in engineering lead to the electrical engineer. There's good kind of horizontal movement, but very little vertical movement there. So whereas with nursing you could move through the quals pretty easily, very few electricians go to university and very few electricians actually become professional engineers. So that's the second way of thinking about the quals. The third and the fourth models are more open still. And here we look at the finance sector, where the quals that the finance sector requires are almost used as a screening device for underlying capacity. So, for example, a lot of the big investment banks, like Macquarie Bank, for example, love engineers. Right? They haven't studied finance. They're just really good at thinking laterally and thinking quantitatively. And so there's another link, quite different to what I explained for nursing, quite different to what I explained for electrical engineering. That's a different way in which you make the connection. And then there's one that's even more broader still, and that's where you basically just look at quals that give you the capacity to flourish in unstructured and undefined domains. And this is like general science degrees and general arts degrees feeding into public administration. You know, there's not a direct link, but it gives you an underlying capability. I think that was a really powerful little typology that Lisa and Gavin worked out. That's all there in their reports. The second finding was, for their one, is that educators have a very systematic way of thinking about qualifications and how they articulate. The labour market does not match that. And you heard in our earlier presentation, there's a hollowing out, not just at the bottom of the labour market and in the middle. The fundamental problem is that middle category in the labour market. That's becoming more unstable. So if you're trying to get a link between education and the labour market, you've just got to think about that reality. And as you'll see, educators can't solve that. I mean, in many ways, our report is pretty kind to educators. Educators fundamentally aren't the problem. Right? The problems are in the labour market and in what we would call like what we call the training market club. That's where the problems are. They're not actually amongst the educators. And then finally, Lisa's very strong on making the point that quals don't just serve one purpose. They serve one of three purposes, right? They're a basis for educational progression, they're a basis for occupational progression, and most importantly of all, they're a basis for social inclusion. Now, as a labour market researcher, I used to be one of those guys who sneered at tapes teaching vets 1s and 2s. I said, why the hell do you spend so much time on vets 1s and 2s? And you saw the data this morning. There's still a whole lot going on in Cert 1s and 2s. But having done quite a bit of field work when I was at the Training and Skills Commission in South Australia, you realise when you go out there, a bucket load of people really don't like school. And they really, and for very good reason. You know, I've done the sociology education, and Cert 1s and 2s actually give them a second chance. And I think that is really important. That's totally lost. That notion is totally lost amongst most policymakers. And the higher up you get, the poorer they understand that notion. So when Lisa says that there, that's not just a glib thing, social inclusion. For us, that's very important. So finally, we then come to our section on the labour market pathways. For us, the key finding was flows of learning and labour are not linear. Now, you might say, why do we have to hire, a bunch of academics for 3 years to tell us the obvious? Well, sometimes you've got to have somebody tell the obvious, because most people do still think in linear terms, and we'll show you the data around that. And secondly, when you're thinking from a labour market capacity, the real issue is not matching quals to jobs. The real issue is handling uncertainty. How do you navigate an uncertain future? In particular, how do you create individuals who are adaptive and workplaces that are adaptive? And that was our framing. Now, what I'm going to do is take you through strand 3 as a case study of what we've done. But if you want more detail around strands 1 and 2, they're all in the report. So on strand 3, this is what I'm going to cover. The current policy assumptions on education and the labour market nexus, noting that the current reality is nothing like those assumptions. We then want to go into why the current situation prevails, how things could be different, and then I want to give you an example from agriculture because that's where we've had most traction for these ideas. I'll show my age here. I was entered the workforce in the early 80s. I worked in the Department of Employment and Industrial Relations and was active as a union delegate and was a big supporter of Laurie Carmichael and his change to the award system. In fact, I got up at mass meetings and defended figures just like that because you remember Laurie Carmichael used to say, the award system has over 350 classifications and we've got to get it down so that people have a career path and move through. Brilliant vision, absolutely brilliant vision. Laurie had this vision, you should be able to start off as a trades assistant, become a trades level worker, become an ADSTI member and work as an engineering technician and then become the degree qualified engineer. Brilliant vision, but we live in a big dark space where that hasn't happened, right? And I've got to declare an interest here. I did my whole PhD on this. I went in as a strong supporter of Laurie and came out as a strong sceptic. So I looked at that, looked at all the detail. This is what Laurie was trying to do and this is what actually happened. Yes, well, Laurie, I actually presented to Laurie and he said, yes, there's a case to answer, which is, if anyone knows Carmichael, that was pretty high praise. So that's what's going on. We said, well, that's what's being asserted. What's actually going on? And here, before I show you the next slide, I want to explain where we're coming from. So, as I mentioned, I led at that stage the Workplace Research Centre. I now work in data science. So, for the people who were talking earlier, I kind of had a late career change. But in doing this, as a labour market researcher, I had a very good data scientist working with us, a woman called Serena Yu, and I said, Serena, this just doesn't seem to make sense. How can we show what's actually going on? So what we did, we did two strategies. We had been running a survey called the Australia at Work Survey, where we tracked 8,000 people over 5 years. We went back to the same people each year and said, where are you going? And I said, Serena, just find me people who've made that transition from trades assistant, trades worker, engineering technician, engineer. Out of 8,500, she found 3. And because we'd been running the survey, we could phone them up, right? Normally when you work with ABS data or other people's data, it's all confidential. Because we've been running this ourselves, a big study, it's a $2 million study, we phoned all 3 of them up and they all said to Serena, don't do it. Tell everyone, don't do it. I never want anyone to go through what I've been through. Because they could make that transition, but it slaughtered their family lives. It stripped out every ounce of discretionary time. And what those interviews showed is that the formal structures for a career progression were there, but the substantive structures of support for paid training leave, for having supportive workplaces that will release people in work time skills, just isn't there. So that was the first finding. The second finding we had was Serena then worked with the HILDA data, the Household Income Labour Market Dynamics of Australia data. It has information on 15,000 individuals over 10 years. So you could do it in more detail. And what I said, all right, Serena, let's look at the different domains. Agricultural work, engineering work, care work, and finance work. And what you can do is track through people's careers. And so these are the flow diagrams that she put together. So this is from agriculture. And what you can actually say is, let's look at people, anyone who worked as a manual labour in agriculture over that 10-year period. And these are the different codes. So they could have been either studying at secondary school, studying vet, higher ed, managerial work, professional work, technical, community service work, sales work. You get the drift. There's a whole lot of things they could do. And the colours show their movements year to year. Right? This shows their movements year to year. And you'll see amongst the farmers, you start that big chunk there in the middle is essentially managers. They're farm managers. They start off as a farm manager. A big chunk of them finish off as farm managers. If they're taking time out, it's usually go back to higher ed. Right? So that's the flow. It's a big chunk of them. They stay there, or if they do, they're just simply moving between higher ed and management. The farm labourers are churning. Right? They're not moving up, they're churning. They're becoming process workers, or they're doing some lower level clerical work, or they're doing some lower level sales work. But there's none of that progression that Laurie envisaged. Right? And we did the same. This is the beauty for care work. There's nurses. You start off a nurse, you stay a nurse. That's over 10 years. That's the PCAs, the carers. Once again, they're churning. They're not becoming nurses. They're not starting off as a PCA. They'll be in PCA for a while. Sorry, it's personal care attendant. Or they'll be a clerical worker or a sales worker and the like. And that's all in Serena's report. And can I say, no one had ever done this in Australia before, the optical matching analysis. She actually pioneered this for Australia. Interestingly, she got it out of career progression in the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. That's where the original data was done. So she's quite novel in bringing out these techniques. So why does this situation persist? Well, fundamentally, the labour market is segmented. This is something that, it's been there in labour economics since the 19th century. Hasn't had much of a run lately because everyone's embraced human capital theory, but the empirical reality is deep segmentation. There are high-skilled trajectories where people basically go from higher ed into the professions. There are low-skilled trajectories which essentially entrench people in low work, and there's a whole lot of people who are marginally attached who drop into and out of the workforce. So we then pose the question, how do you make sense of these facts? Now, anyone who knows me knows I do a lot of presentations. I don't usually use pictures, but I have in this case had to stoop to using pictures. And the reason I did that is that when you want to make sense of a complex dynamic like we've identified here, pictures help. And so I thought, well, I was trained by Bob Gregory as a labour economist, and Gregory used to make the point, the labour market is more like a river than a lake. But when people think of economists use comparative static analysis, it's very sterile, frankly. But labour economists have identified the importance of flow. And so that notion of having the vision of a river as a lake is actually a big breakthrough. So I thought, well, maybe it's like Warragamba Dam, and I'm sorry, I am from Sydney, but it's that Sydney's water supply, basically. And you'll see there's a major dam, but there are little leakages out. And I thought, well, maybe that's what's going on. Remember, I showed you there those flows of the PCAs, and there are little leakages out, but fundamentally they're stuck in that middle strata. But I thought, that's too sterile. It's not like one big chunk of people stuck in this PCA grade. Remember, they were churning between clerical workers and sales workers and lower-level clerical work. So I said, well, maybe it's more like the Billabong. There's a big flow here and people get left behind. And I thought, no, that's missing the dynamism too. So I had to go across the Tasman to find the image we're after, which is the Braided River. Right, and the beauty of the New Zealand Braided River is that it shows you that there is some coherence, but it's not mechanistic. Right? It's organic. And the labour market has contours that don't neatly look like the grids of a traffic system. They evolve organically. So you'll see there's a big flow. And remember when I showed you with the nurses, there was a big chunk. That's like the nurses in the middle. But there are little flows into and out and around. Where's the jig boat? But there's also flows out of the Braided River as well as within it. So people will often drop out to have a child, or they'll have a spell of unemployment, or they take time out to have education. The question is, how do people flow back in? And this is when we're thinking from a policy point of view. You've got to look at these flows, you've got to understand the nature of the flows, you've got to work with them, and in some cases we're going to have to build dams or we're going to have to build canals. We have to think in terms of flows, we've got to think in terms of structures of support, not just formal quals. So, how do we describe these flows? Well, this is where we get this notion of vocation. For us, a vocational stream is, as we've got there, a set of occupations linked by common knowledge, skills and capabilities within a broader field of practice. And as I mentioned before, the ones we've seen from my 25 years of research are around care work, financial advice, logistics, engineering, animal and husbandry, and customer service. Now, these links are important because they provide the basis for basically adaptive capacity. What we're talking about is, in these domains, if you take care work, for example, the case that we've been most interested in is you've got aged care workers, you've got disability support workers, you've got drug and alcohol workers. But there's an underlying capability of care there. And the New Zealanders, once again because of scale, have had to confront this problem. Sometimes demand for disability support workers passes in the district, so they flick them into aged care. So they've just started to develop a more broader qualification around care work. And this is what we're thinking of. How do you have an underlying capability with both its underpinning knowledge and its practice, which you can then specialise around? Now, so what I've taken you through is what we did in our second year. So in our third year, we said, well, how can you improve vocational streams? And this is where we're moving out of the world of the is and into the world of what ought to be. And we said there are two enabling conditions for a decent vocational stream. The first is commonalities and capabilities, or what we call capabilities in common. And that goes, take that example of care work, but you can also look at it in agricultural work. For example, we looked at the notion of rural operations. And that is both a combination of a technical question and a political question. How do you aggregate what is common? Right? And you can look at this in particular domains of the labour market. But as I've said, engineering is a classic example. Everyone would have thought, well, of all the industries or all the occupations, there's going to be an international standard. But the way the US defines and trains its engineers is very different to the way we do. So this leads to the second thing. What is the readiness of social partners to cooperate in defining those domains, right? Because in some domains, everyone will get together and say, yeah, we've got to come together and raise the standing of our sector. In others, they fight like dogs and cats. Like you put them in a room, they say, get nicked. And so that gave us a framework for looking at the ability of different parts of the economy to embrace this framework. So along the bottom here, we said, what's the ease with which you can identify capabilities in common? And on that, we found health has got the greatest possibilities, right? You guys from Queensland mentioned the example of care work. Similarly, in finance, there's a high degree of finding underlying capabilities. Engineering, on the other hand, has got a huge amount of goodwill. We love working with engineers, actually. They're very impressive. And Central Queensland Uni, I have to say, is a standout performer here, particularly in mining. Now, but they looked at it really hard, and they were just saying, we want this to work, but we're trying really hard to find the commonality between a software engineer and a civil engineer. Right, just the domains themselves, the realities they have to engage with are so specifically different, you know, the properties they've got to engage with. So that's why we've got to spread community services health, high degree of capabilities in common, engineering less so. But then the other axis is, what is the preparedness of the social parties to come together and talk about these issues, right? And the engineers, everyone wants to talk about it, but there isn't much to actually agree on what's common. Health, well, it's a colour-coded division of labour. I mean, if you go into a hospital, you'll actually find people have different uniforms or they have different names on that. They've embedded the division of labour quite profoundly. So it's very difficult there to get capabilities in common. Not impossible. And we go into the report in quite some lengths, and I say a lot of research has died to get that point to you about the vetting schools. The second highest death rate was those studying health, because when you start talking about changing skills in health, you're entering into a very murky terrain. But we found ways through that, and I'm happy to take questions on that if you like. So that's where you get the arc of what are the capabilities and capacity for identifying capabilities in common, what is the incidence of preparedness to negotiate, and the sweet spot is in agriculture. In agriculture, there is a high capacity to identify common domains where people can share skills, and there's a very high level of goodwill amongst the leaders in the ag sector to try and do something about it. So I'll just give you a quick example of, I'm running out of time, so I'll just wrap it up quickly. In ag, we found that, now just look at these numbers, there are over 100 quals below Cert 3 in ag. Right? This is for a part of the workforce that accounts for about 1.5% of the labour market. And they're multiplying. So they're actually going in the wrong direction. And so we said, this isn't, and can I say, this is not a problem unique to VET. Sydney Uni, you should see the data map on quals at Sydney Uni alone. I mean, there's just a problem with educators just creating more and more quals. So I'm not saying higher ed's got it right, but we said maybe you've got to think about quals differently. And when we drew heavily on the experience of work that's been going on in Narrabri, in northwest New South Wales around the cotton sector there, and they've stripped down the quals to some really basic categories, and they have essentially general agriculture and rural operations, right? And that's for the certs 1, 2 and 3, and I've listed there what the elements would be. So, and this has come from Neil Jacobson and the people who he works with at Twerk College. This is not our work, we've worked collaboratively with them. And you'll see we've listed there what the underlying capabilities are and how they could be arrayed across both general ag and rural ops. I can take questions on this later if you like, because I'd rather get to the end. And we've shown what the labour market flows are around that. So for those of you who are interested, we've then looked across all of this again and said, we started with a fairly heavy attack on the current orthodoxy in both analysis and in policy. We've come up with an alternative framing set of categories drawn from the capabilities approach. So this isn't just a kind of pragmatic and opportunistic set of concepts we've come forward. We've actually worked out a different way of thinking about the labour market for those of you who are interested in more robust ways of thinking. So this is the second last slide. Was the project worth it? Yeah, of course we have to say yes. We didn't waste 3 years of our lives. But yes, there's been a huge amount of new knowledge created, got concrete suggestions for a new approach, and there's been lots of interest in taking this forward. You'll see the acronyms there, AURPA, the AQFC, Community Service and Health ISC, and Manufacturing Skills Australia, all gone, right? All wiped out. State governments, South Australia and Tasmania have been interested. The New South Wales government has actually commissioned us to take these ideas forward for the next 3 years. Right, so there's some good news there, and that's the Skills Board and the Department of Industry there. But the greatest support has come out of agriculture, particularly the dairy industry and parts of cotton. But once again, this is all really nascent. I don't want to talk this up. We haven't solved it. We've got people prepared to explore a new way of going forward. The solution isn't at Narrabri, the solution isn't at dairy, but you've got people who are taking the first steps down the road to try and get something more sustainable. But we've got to be honest with you. Has the project been worth it? Well, to be blunt, the impact on policy has been zero. Because whilst we were doing all of this, the Victorian disease was spreading nationwide, right? So, and as we were doing this research, the scandals were breaking out on the stock market, that a whole lot of fly-by-nighters had been deceiving people left, right and centre. The people who've been shaping policy have been the shonks. I mean, let's be quite clear about that. And they've had a huge impact on the public providers. So I'm being realistic here. I don't want to say we got the solution and people embracing it. We got the solution, and I don't get murdered when I give seminars like this anymore. The first time I gave this, it got shredded. Now people at least listen politely. Probably the biggest problem of all is there's no coherent employee voice on this stuff. Pat Ford and the AEU have been good, but the unions, frankly, have been pathetic. We've got probably more resistance from the leading union people in this space than any other domain. And look, anyone who knows my politics knows that I would start off life as a union activist. I still work with unions. But in the area of skills, they were the last people to come around to this way of thinking. But they're there. That's the good news. They're there. They're interested in going down this path. So the irony, I say, is outside of TAFE teachers, the only groups that have really embraced this big time have been the agricultural employers, particularly in dairy, and now the New South Wales Skills Board and Department. So I've outlined where next, but we've run out of time. What are the conclusions? Well, the conclusions are this. Thanks again to the NCVER. I think you can see I'm not just pissing in their pockets. They've given us a space. They've given us a space to think about some really big ideas. The big conclusion that kind of reinforces what our colleagues from Queensland were saying earlier, the vet system is currently dysfunctional, right? The stock market scandals are extraordinary. Just think of the magnitude of these losses. If there'd been a Labor government in power, the Murdoch press would be talking about nothing else. Let's be quite clear about that. There's been a federal minister who's been covering all this. He's presided over its continuation. If there'd been a Labor government in there and there'd been hundreds of millions of dollars shoveled out to people, and they're getting rates of return of up to 50% on the stock market. This is unheard of, right? So we all know about it, but people still haven't registered the full significance of this. We've heard the talk of a training market for 20 years now. The first time that rhetoric was tested on the capital market, it didn't last 6 months, right? Just think about that. TAFE's been subjected to wave after wave of marketisation. The first time the private providers actually put themselves on public display, they couldn't last a year. That's a really important point. We've got to also remember that it's not all hopeless. Key parts of the Australian vocational education training system are of incredibly good quality, and they have survived. A lot of it is in TAFE, but it is also things like Lady Gowrie and the community services sector. We've got to work with that. So whilst some people have been doing their best to shred the reputation of VET, big parts of it do survive. But we would say this preoccupation with right skills, right time, right place is just wrong. It's analytically flawed, and we've shown it's got no empirical foundations. We've got to think about the capacity to adapt to uncertainty. You can't ever get it right. You can't say we're going to need, 20,000 electrical fitters in 5 years' time. Chances are you're probably going to need 40,000 or you're going to need 5,000. But if you've trained them in underlying capability, it doesn't matter. They can go to where they're needed. What we really need is a vision of vocational development as integral to economic and social development. Right? We've provided the pointers, but we can't, we're researchers. We can only take this so far. Where should we go in the short run? Well, and our research team works at sectoral level and at regional level where there is traction for these kind of things. And I've told you where we've been finding that most. But I think we should have an eye for a potential big shift in policy. My sense is there's more chance now than there has been in the last 20 years for sense and reason to prevail in this space. Like for the last 20 years, VET policy has been dominated by people who know nothing about education and even less about the labour market. Well, let's make sure they don't get away with it for any longer. Thank you.